Member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it is my pleasure to rise today to speak to Bill C-8. It's my first time giving a speech in the House in the new year, not my first time on my feet, but my first time speaking at length. And so it's the first time speaking in the House since the Omicron wave really took hold seriously. And I just want to take a moment to recognize just what a punch in the stomach that's felt like, I think, to Canadians across the country, many of whom had some hope that we were kind of getting beyond the pandemic. And then when this wave came, I think felt all of those many feelings that we had been feeling over the past 2 years kind of condensed into a new wave of the pandemic. And I want to say a special thank you to all of the frontline workers that we talked about at the beginning of the pandemic who never went away and never stopped doing those important tasks, even though the limelight shifted away from them, whether it's the healthcare workers that continue to labor in really difficult circumstances. They're overworked, they're tired, they're under-resourced, teachers and childcare workers that have had to face the pandemic all the way through. But in this particular wave, I'll speak at least to my own experience here in Manitoba, where before they were having the challenges of remote learning, are now having to deal with, full classrooms and students who are getting sick and colleagues who are getting sick or getting sick themselves. Grocery store workers are putting themselves at risk once again. And as my colleague from Windsor West has rightly pointed out, some of the big grocery chains that had said, when we got another wave coming, we're gonna bring back hero pay in order to recognize the risk that our workers are taking in order to help Canadians who haven't stepped up in order to reinstitute that hero pay in recognition of the work that's been doing. And that has led to, all of these things together are leading to a lot of outrage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I find particularly outrageous today and then inform my work. I'm outraged when I get emails, as I did today, about another senior that has lost their life not because of the pandemic directly, because they took the government at their word when the government would be there to have their back and that they would support them through the pandemic. And when they lost their job, that they should apply for help. And so they did. They applied for CERB. And then the government, because it couldn't figure out its own rules, and I think that's probably the most charitable interpretation, or because it didn't care, decided to claw those benefits that were supposed to be for working seniors in need back through the guaranteed income supplement. And not only did they do that and they didn't, catch it before it happened, they were advised at least as early as May of 2021 that was happening, and they chose to do nothing about it. They chose to do nothing about it. You could say, well, until it happened, except that it happened in July, and they still did nothing about it. They called an election. They did nothing about it. They came back from the election. They did nothing about it. It took weeks of persistently raising this in the House of Commons to get an announcement. And that announcement didn't solve the problem because that money still isn't in the pockets of seniors who are in dire need. Like the senior that we found out about today, who has type 2 diabetes and could no longer afford the food that they needed to be healthy and the medication that they needed, and so passed away. And I've got an email open in front of me, a couple from Mississauga who are in dire straits. Together, two of them are trying to live on $1,300 a month because their GIS payments have been gone. And the government says, well, don't worry, we've got a solution. We're gonna give them a one-time payment in May or June. There are already seniors that aren't there, that are no longer living, who will not receive that payment, and there will be more by May or June. That outrages me. It outrages me on the substance of the matter because Canada should do better. And it outrages me because it breaks the promise that the Prime Minister made to people in this country that the government would be there for them. And instead, on a principle of bureaucracy, because they couldn't figure out their internal systems, or they don't have the right list, or they're not sure about this, or maybe we need to do that, after just proving to the country that when the political will exists, they can roll out a program to millions of Canadians, almost overnight. They expect us to believe that these seniors that were already receiving money from government, who are already on a list, who are already in a system that we're paying them, that they can't find a way to get money into those seniors' hands so they're not dying in the cold? It's not believable, and it's shameful. I'm outraged about that, and I'm proud that people in Elmwood Transcona sent me here to relay that message to the government, and I'm going to keep doing that until that money gets in the hands of seniors and they get back in their homes and out of the jeopardy that they're in because this government can't be bothered to take on its own bureaucracy who's telling them something that needs to be done can't be done when we all know that's not true. That outrages me. I'm outraged that people during the pandemic were dying in personal care homes because of years of cuts at the federal and provincial level to healthcare, when we know that our system has been under-resourced. And those cuts came not because Canada couldn't afford to do those things. You know, over the years that those cuts came to our healthcare system, the corporate tax rate in Canada went down from 28% to just 15%. That is a huge decrease. That is almost a 50% tax cut to the largest corporations in Canada. Well, our government was telling us that they couldn't afford to pay their fair share of healthcare to the provinces. That's shameful. That's shameful. And what's more shameful still is that we're 2 years into this pandemic. There's hardly a long-term care center in Winnipeg that doesn't have a COVID-19 outbreak. And there has been no work done to convene the provinces to talk about better national standards and funding those standards by the federal government. I'm not talking about the federal government telling the provinces what to do. I'm talking about convening them so that they can talk about best practices so that every Canadian can benefit from the best things that our provincial governments are doing to serve Canadians in long-term care, and then ensuring that their federal government is at the table to help resource those things. That was the power of...
I need to interrupt. I hate to interrupt. Can you move the mic up just a little bit? Interpretation's having a little time. A lot of popping coming off of your microphone there. Perfect. Thank you. The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
I suspect that may have something to do with the shouting, Mr. Speaker, but I did say I was outraged, and I suppose that has some technical consequences. So here we are. We're 2 years into the pandemic. We haven't made significant progress on long-term care. It's not like the experts that have been advising governments on how to handle the pandemic were caught off guard that there was another wave of the pandemic. Even early on, they were saying there'd be probably at least 4 waves. And we know that these are problems that need to get fixed, even if somehow magically the pandemic were to end tomorrow. And we hear certain members in the House even today suggesting that somehow, you know, the pandemic is a function of public health restrictions or something. If you end the public health restrictions, you don't end the pandemic. I wish that were true. But we're fighting a virus. We're not fighting each other. And we need to bear that in mind. And the way to get through this is with a lot of care and resources, to be sure. You know, and so as we were cutting those taxes for big corporations and telling people that we couldn't fund the healthcare that they need, you know, that was also being done by a lot of governments. We see it provincially. I mean, we're seeing it here in Manitoba. We see it in Alberta. We're seeing this around the country because we've got people in government that don't believe in public health care in the first place and would rather see it privatized and would rather give tax cuts to big corporations instead of ponying up the funding that we know is necessary to have proper health care. I'm outraged that this government, which promised, the Liberal Party promised as long ago as 1997, but this government has said again and again and again until their most recent speech from the throne that they're going to make progress on pharmacare. Why am I mad about that? Because I understand that people are really getting hit hard in the pocketbook with the inflation that's happening. And I know there's no magic wand in the desk of government, and some of the factors driving inflation right now are beyond their control. But what is in their control? Well, they could certainly help with the cost of prescription drugs because a national pharmacare program would do that. It would save money. It actually costs less to have such a program than Canadians are spending right now on prescription drugs. I mean, we're going back a couple of years now on a PBO study, but the PBO was very clear. Right now, Canadians are spending about $24 billion a year on prescription drugs with the many provincial systems that we have and the many private plans, and one national system would cost about $20 billion a year. That is a way to save money and serve people better and help bring down some of those costs that are making things so hard for Canadians right now. It's something the government absolutely needs to do and would help. The NEP has long proposed taking on telecom companies. Canadians are paying among the highest rates for cell phone and internet. That's not a luxury anymore. It's not a nice to have. If you want to participate in the labor market, good luck finding a job and keeping a job if you don't have access to the internet or to a cell phone. So that's something that the government could do. They could take a regulatory approach to bringing down prices and making sure that at the very least, there's a genuinely affordable plan for basic access to something as important as cell phone and internet rates. So we're talking about Bill C-8. What's in it? Well, nothing particularly offensive, but not a lot of the things that we really need. And I think that's the dilemma. And I think that's certainly there are many Canadians who are frustrated that in this time of real difficulty and real challenge with the pandemic, but also I think for many of us, a real looming sense of challenge when we look at what's happening to the planet and we look at all the extreme weather events, we look at the economic disruption that's going to cause and the displacement of people that is going to cause, that we're just not rising to the occasion. So yes, absolutely. We should be helping businesses improve their ventilation systems. That is the right thing to do in the context of the pandemic. And these measures make sense as a way of contributing to that. We ought to be helping schools improve their ventilation systems. I don't think that, it's a real answer to reimburse teachers for some of what they're paying out of pocket, because I don't think teachers should have to pay out of pocket. But until we have governments that are willing to fund education to the extent that it needs to be, so that every student has what they need, I'm thankful to teachers who are willing to go above and beyond. And I'm willing to support a measure that gives them at least a little bit of relief for doing things out of compassion for their students that they really shouldn't have to do, because that's a compassion that we should have collectively. And we should work collectively to fund the things that students need instead of leaving it to their teachers on an individual basis. I am glad in principle that the government is looking at having some kind of underused housing tax. And I think it will be important to interrogate that seriously at committee, because initial analyses suggest that, there are loopholes that you could drive trucks through in this legislation. And there is a lot else that we need to do in order to tackle the problems of the housing market. Some things that the Liberals themselves promised in the last election, like, for instance, banning blind bidding. That's a platform commitment of the Liberal Party. Why is that not here? What possibly could they be waiting for? Are house prices not high enough? Do they need to escalate faster in order for Liberals just to make good on their own election commitments? Give me a break. Come on. That stuff should at least be here. And we know also that we need a serious plan, not the national housing strategy that they love to tout, because it is inadequate. We need to get more real units. And I'm not talking about so-called affordable housing, which has a technical definition that really just means high rent for most people, rent that they can't afford. We need to build rent geared to income housing, and we need to explore non-market options like co-ops and other things like that, so that we take the speculation out of enough of the housing market that people really can access housing. And that will also help relieve cost pressures, so that people for whom home ownership is a real goal, and it will be a larger group if prices come down, as it was just not that long ago, that will help them out too by relieving demand in the housing market and helping to lower prices overall. So these are things that we really need to be doing. I do look forward to having an intensive study of this new proposed Underused Housing Act at committee. I think that's a good piece of parliamentary work, but we're kidding ourselves if we think that that's really going to change the fundamental trajectory of the Canadian housing market, not just in the last 2 years, as conservatives would have you believe, but over the last 20 years. where prices have been going up consistently, because we've had federal governments that since the mid-90s have not come to the table with enough funding to build enough non-market housing to relieve serious pressure on the market. And that's something that absolutely needs to happen. There is more money proposed for things that we need, particularly rapid tests, and that's something that we're quite supportive of. There are some questions. I did ask the Associate Minister of Finance earlier, and I was somewhat dismayed that he didn't have an answer. In Bill C-8, there is proposals for money for rapid tests, and in a standalone bill, C-10, they propose to spend money on rapid tests. One asks, this bill, C-8, asks for $1.72 billion for rapid tests. C-10 asks for $2.5 billion for rapid tests, and the Associate Minister of Finance in this government couldn't give a clear answer whether they're asking for $4.2 billion combined, or whether it's the $2.5 billion in C-10, or it's the $1.7 billion in C-8. I think Canadians should know, and I think Parliament should expect to have some reliable reporting out on those numbers as we go, because as we know, the Parliamentary Budget Officer just not that long ago said that the government, when it came to tabling their public accounts, was considerably late, that it was an outlier in terms of our other G7 countries. And I think the government really needs to get with the program. There has been a need for a considerable amount of public spending, but the fact that we need to spend isn't a reason not to report well on what it's being spent on and not to do it in a timely way. In fact, it becomes that much more important that government report well and report in a timely fashion on its spending when so much money is going out the door and so quickly. So there are certainly things to talk about in that regard. Suffice it to say, Mr. Speaker, while I'm not impressed to the extent to which many of the things that we need to rise to the moment, whether it's in the face of the pandemic or the climate challenge, aren't in here, I'm not of the view that this is a reason for these things not to proceed. But I really think that the government needs to figure out how to rise to the occasion and move forward with a sense of urgency. And particularly, I'm going to reiterate one more time as I draw to the close of my time, Mr. Speaker, the extent to which it has to internalize the sense of urgency required when it comes to these seniors who have had their benefits clawed back by the government. They're not just losing the income, they're also losing access to provincial programs in many cases that were part of their support network that kept them housed and fed and alive. And all of that has been called into jeopardy because of the government's refusal to act swiftly in May of last year when they knew that this was going to be a problem. So that is something absolutely they have to act with urgency on. And they have to make sure that all of the people who are still out of work because of the pandemic, like, let's not kid ourselves. We all know somebody, at least one person, if not more, who are struggling to get back to the job that they had, or to get enough hours in a new job, or who are working, who just can't support their family. And the 40% cut to the pandemic benefits was bad enough to go from $500 a week to $300 a week. But in addition to that, with the Canada Worker Lockdown benefit, the government made it way harder for people to access that help. So my office is hearing from people in Elma-Transcona, and we're hearing from people across the country who are trying to access this benefit in a time of incredible need, who can't. They just can't access it. And they're being told that it should take, a matter of days for a response. And they've waited weeks and they still haven't got a response. So the government had a system that was providing income support to a lot of people. When they ended it, it was still providing support to about 900,000 people. And what they replaced it with just is not adequate to the task, both in terms of how much it delivers and in terms of the criteria that people have to navigate in order to access it, Mr. Speaker. So as I say, this is a bill that can certainly go to committee. There are things worth looking at in here, but this isn't the kind of leadership that we need at the moment. It doesn't, the government has to do more to rise to the occasion. And I will continue to be here, and my New Democratic colleagues will continue to be here to press the government to rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, the honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would disagree with the overall assessment from the member when he talks about seniors. As a parliamentarian for over 30 years, I have witnessed NDP governments at the provincial level in Manitoba, many years of that, many years of progressive conservative governments, and I can tell you in the last 5-6 years since this Prime Minister and this Cabinet and my colleagues have been at work, we have done more for seniors and supporting seniors in real, tangible ways. And I look and I reflect, and when the member talked about, well, corporate tax breaks, I'd like to remind, there was 3, 4, maybe 6 corporate tax breaks from NDP in the province of Manitoba while there was a need for funding long-term care, which was the total responsibility of the NDP provincial government. Does he see any hypocrisy that might be there? And would he not recognize, as a government, we've been very progressive on providing for and being there for our seniors because it is a right thing to do?
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Elmswood Transcona.
I'll tell you what's different, Mr. Speaker. In this case, what you had were seniors who were working to top up their guaranteed income supplement benefit. They lost their job when the pandemic started. They were told, apply for help, you're going to get some supplementary income, it's going to replace what you had. When they said, well, it's a little more than what I usually make, the government said, don't worry, just apply, we got your back, there's not going to be any penalty. Some of them ended up fixing their car, some of them fixed their teeth, some of them paid bills that were in arrears. And then when the time came to assess them for the guaranteed income supplement next year, without the government having told them that their pandemic benefit was going to count against them in the calculation of their GIS, which represents not only their GIS, but a bunch of other programs for which GIS enrollment is a precondition that supported them, the government just started clawing it back. And they knew for months that it was coming, and they didn't care, and they didn't do anything about it, and people are being evicted, and some people are dying. That's a huge difference. This has to do with the government and how it's managed its own internal bureaucracy, and it's costing lives. That hasn't happened before.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I greatly enjoyed my colleague's speech. We may not agree about everything, but I appreciate his passion and sincerity and how he speaks from the heart. I think that any social worker or economist would tell us, and whatever this government tells us with the statistics they're throwing out, I think anyone would tell us that our seniors are getting poorer. These people who build Quebec, who build Canada, thanks to whom we have a democracy, freedom, quality of life today, instead of helping them today, we're letting them get poorer. And then additionally, the wealth of the wealthiest among us is skyrocketing. Not only are the wealthy becoming wealthier, but they're also hiding their money in tax havens. So with those two facts in mind, I would like to ask my honourable colleague, I would like to ask him how he can explain that this government isn't doing anything for seniors, and then to add insult to injury, not only is it not helping seniors, but it's not doing anything about tax havens. The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. That is exactly why I think we can do much more for Canadians, for our seniors, and anyone who needs support. And I'm not just talking about direct financial support. A better healthcare system. More financial support for provinces so they can have a better healthcare system. That can come from the federal government. There's the matter of tax rates for the biggest corporations and the wealthiest. There's the matter of tax loopholes. We've seen in the last few months that 1% of the Canadian population has 25% of the wealth. Sorry, I don't know the word in French, but has 25% of the wealth, and that's not sustainable. We can provide all the services that Canadians need without being able to access more income. And when 1% of the population has so much wealth and doesn't pay its fair share, we have a real problem.
Kamal Tara, the honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really appreciate having the opportunity to get up and ask my colleague this question. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'm really disappointed in this House today to listen to the member from Winnipeg North talk about something that clearly he does not understand. The reality is, a few days ago, a senior in this country was put into ICU because they could not get their GIS because it was clawed back, which meant that member of our community, of our country, could not get the medication to serve their type 2 diabetes and could not feed themselves in a way to stay healthy. They went into ICU, and last night they died. That is a human being, a senior in this country, who worked hard to build our country, who did nothing wrong. Like every other working Canadian, when they lost their job, applied for the only money they could to make ends meet. So I really hope that this government will listen to Campaign 2000, who is requesting desperately a small payment in advance so that they don't have to wait more months. I'm just wondering if this member could talk about how long seniors have to wait for this government to take the death of seniors due to their decisions seriously.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you to the member for North Island Powell River, both for the question, but also for all the work and advocacy that she's undertaken to do on this file since we first found out about it. And the reality that is stark and that we are seeing very clearly is that poverty kills, and poverty can kill people just as sure as this pandemic can. It's why it was so important to have a full economic response and financial response to the pandemic. That's why New Democrats fought so hard for a $2,000 a month benefit. And it's why, given that we're clearly not out of this pandemic, it was wrong for the Liberals to cut that down by 40%. It was wrong for them to claw it back from seniors. And I don't know how long we're going to have to wait in order for the government to make this right. But I know that there are many seniors out there who can't afford to wait any longer than they already have, and that the government needs to find a way to act on an urgent basis. Campaign 2000 had two calls. One was for a direct emergency payment to affected seniors. The other was for a housing fund to get the ones who have already been evicted or who are facing eviction, rehoused, or to keep them in their home. The government should do both. It needs to pick at least one, so that we can get these seniors off the street and back somewhere safe so that they can make it to the day that the government is finally ready to offer compensation.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Calgary Centre. And if we do this quick, we might get another one online.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I really enjoyed the speech from my colleague from Winnipeg. Thank you for that. There was one thing he raised in that speech that I want to talk to him about or ask him some questions on. He talked about the federal tax rate going from 28% to 15% at the same time as the federal government under the Chrétien Liberals at that point in time, 1992, 1994, 1995, when they actually reduced the contribution from the federal government from 50% of healthcare funding down to its current level of 22%. Of course, that thrusted a whole bunch of costs onto the provincial governments that have to invest that money now, but it also ceded those tax points from 28% to 15%. And my honourable colleague over there from Winnipeg, Trascota doesn't seem to like that idea. But the issue is that's supposed to cede to those provinces, allow them that space to fill. Now, my colleague knows that healthcare costs have gone up in every province, and yet our healthcare outcomes haven't met the increase. We still have desperate need for better facilities, and yet we're not getting great outcomes. Tell us what he thinks the solution should be to this.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona in 37 seconds.
Sure. Well, I would point out that the other decrease in the corporate tax rate from 22 to 15% happened under the Harper government, and that they did that while they reduced the escalator for provincial funding or federal funding to provinces for healthcare. So there's enough blame to go around between Liberals and Conservatives for the diminishing amount of money that goes out to the provinces. Part of the solution, frankly, is the health accord model, where the federal government brings provinces around the table to talk about best practices. I worked in the Minister of Health's office in Manitoba, and some of the things we saw the most success on were the 5 priority areas coming out of the 2004 Health Accord, because provinces decided what the priorities were, they decided how to measure progress, and then they had federal money to meet those standards. And so that's where you see progress. When you get together, you plan and you fund success. And that is the promise the Liberals broke when they were elected in 2015 after running on a new health accord. Shame on them. That's the model that we need to get back to.